Well, here we are, Bill, for our final discussion of the Consolation of Philosophy. After a lot of chapters with a lot of dense, important material about free will and God's sovereignty, I want us to discuss, I want to end with how we should live if this is true, what all this actually means to us. So, philosophy is discussing necessity here. God's knowledge is different in quality than ours, it's superior to ours. In chapter 6, she's unpacking chapter 4, where she says people think that all knowledge is based on an object's nature, but that's not true. What we know is according to our ability to know, and we know greater than, say, a mollusk knows, but God knows things in a different way than we know them. And so she describes God's eternality, and she defines it like this: the whole and perfect possession of endless life. And we use those words, but of course we can't fully comprehend it, because there's a time when you and I began to exist, and you can't just leap forward in time. Sometimes I think the other day, my 5-year-old daughter said, or maybe it was my 3-year-old son, one of them, when will I be 4, 5, 6, 7? When will I be? It's like, and I said, a long time. Yeah. Now I could say it'll go by like that, but to them, it's a long time. You can't just get there. And once you get there, you can't go back.
Right.
But God dwells in an eternal present. So really, if we talk about God's foreknowledge, that word can lead us to a misunderstanding.
Mm-hmm.
We should just talk about God's knowledge.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's how, what are we talking about when we're talking about knowledge? Are we talking purely about sort of a kind of a precognition, which I don't think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think that's what's going on here. There's the notion of knowledge and action, will, determination, all of that is all one thing here, isn't it?
Yeah, because Boethius points out like the rewards or the punishments God gives to the evil. So it's how God acts in response to us, as it were. But if what we're doing is necessary because God knows it in advance, then how can he punish us? So it's not just God knows in his brain. Yeah.
Right. And I think the reason why I bring that up is because the notion of knowledge in the eternal mind of God is very different than the notion of knowledge. I mean, we think of knowledge. We acquire knowledge. God doesn't acquire knowledge.
No.
God is never, nothing, I like to joke about this and be playful with this, nothing has ever occurred to God.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, because God has never had a new thought.
And has that ever occurred to you?
Yeah, right? Exactly, right? I mean, we cannot think of God in using those terms. God has never forgotten anything. God has never learned anything. And any notion where we get overtones of that in the scripture is just accommodation to us and in a gracious condescension on his part. So God's knowledge is not like our knowledge. I mean, Isaiah says that. Right? Your ways are not my ways are not your ways. So I think that's got to be a starting point here, don't you think?
That's good. It's hard for us to grasp it though.
It is.
Because we talk about past and future, but so which year is farther away from God? 2025 BC or 2025 AD?
Yeah.
Well, really, if you think of like a circle and a point in the middle, which point on the circumference of the circle is furthest away from the dot in the middle?
Right.
Well, that's like God and time.
Right.
So it's not like God is going to answer my prayer tomorrow. He's waiting for tomorrow to happen so we can do it.
Right.
Like he's, I like how Anselm put it 900 years ago. He said, "You, although nothing exists with you, do not exist in a place or time. You do not exist in a place or a time.
Right.
Rather, all things exist in you. For nothing contains you, but you contain all things.
Right. And of course that's proslogion, right? He's writing that to God.
Yes,
He's
it's a
addressing
prayer to God, exactly.
when he said much in the same vein as Augustine's Confessions. Right?
Mm-hmm. So our mistake comes when we're thinking about time and knowledge and sovereignty and free will and wrestling with this as if we have to solve it,
right?
As if we've got to be able to grasp it.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, how can we imagine what it's like to be a clam in the sand?
Right.
What it knows, like it can't possibly comprehend what it is to be human. So how can we comprehend what it is to be God?
Exactly.
God's graciously disclosed much truth in Scripture, but still we can't grasp it.
Yeah, and again, it's very difficult for us to really enter into that because we think of time, we measure time, and we think of decay. That's a foreign concept as we think of God. I mean, God knows no decay, even in terms of His plan of redemption, that's timeline. Well, that insinuates a past and a present and a future. Well, again, those are pure accommodations God has to, because we are created. And because we are created, we had a beginning, which means we will have an end. Well, God is not created, and therefore we can't use the same categories or designations of God, because again, God never began and He will never end, and God doesn't think in terms of timelines.
I think it was maybe John of Damascus who said, God is not one of the things that exist.
Right.
Which sort of blows your mind if you're not used to thinking that way. God does not exist in the sense of you have like the kingdom of everything that exists, and you've got the phyla in there and the genuses and all that. God isn't in that group.
No.
All those things exist in God.
Right.
He's completely outside it all. So that's a call to such humility for us.
Exactly.
How can we understand the plan of God? But also there should be a joy, I think, because although God is, as far as the heavens are above the earth, so are His thoughts higher than our thoughts. And yet, how do we know that? Well, we're reading it in Isaiah, where God tells us this. And so we can seek to understand, because God has given us revelation and minds to think, but we need humility to say, I can never wrap my mind around this.
Well, and I think that's such an important concept, because here we are using the rationality that God has given within the context of a time-space-mass continuum, if we want to think of it that way, that God has provided. So our ability to reason and rationalize and interact with the world in which we live, God has authored all of that. So now, so therefore, in order for us to flourish in the world that God has created, with the knowledge that God has given in the context in which He has called us to operate, then there's obviously going to be limitations to that, because we are created beings. So for us to think that somehow we are going to solve the problem, quote unquote, of God's sovereignty and human freedom in terms of freedom of the will, or we would say the bondage of the will, or we would say human responsibility, then to do that without revelation is simply not going to happen. It's a fruitless endeavor.
Okay, so God knows all things at all times in this simple, effortless glance, all events. So then, even though, well, maybe I should say it like this. He knows all events, and He's able to distinguish those that by nature are necessary and those that are not necessary. So choices that human beings make where they could make different choices, not necessary actions or necessary things. So like if a circle is a circle, it's got to be round. If it's a square, it's got to have four sides.
Right.
Necessary. But so we're making these choices. So Boethius, or philosophy, is telling Boethius the knowledge that God has is not forcing you to act. Just because God knows you will act in a certain way is not pressuring you from the outside, because God has given you a nature as a being to choose different things. Now you can't change God's knowledge,
right,
because God already knows it all. But that doesn't mean our wills are being coerced.
Right.
So I was thinking of this in relation to, say, if I'm playing hockey. If I'm skating on the ice, if I start thinking, I mean, God knows all things, he's predestined all things that are going to happen. I mean, wouldn't it be easy for me to just drop my stick and skate off the ice? Because it's like, what's the point? Well, but then I'm not going to be helping my team.
Right.
So, okay, so I'm going to choose. I'm carrying the puck up the left wing. Am I going to pass or shoot? Well, God knows all these things, but that doesn't mean that I shouldn't try to make the right decision and look where the defenseman is, if I should pass or if I should shoot, all those sorts of things. Nothing's compelling me to do that.
Right.
I'm not being forced outside my will. And yet nothing that I do is outside the eternal foreknowledge of God. I mean, that's just hockey. That's not any important thing in life.
Right. But still, in a very real sense, you playing hockey and in that context is it falls under the rubric of the decree of God, right? In terms of the eternal decree of God. It's the expression of the will of God that is exhaustive, that is it can't be controverted in any way, shape, or form, and yet those choices and decisions are freely made, and so they're genuine choices.
Right.
In other words, they're not. It's not play acting or anything. So it's arising from our will, our wills, which are fallen wills, but again, which nonetheless bear the image of God, and as a result of that, we are choosing. The choices are real, but within the exhaustive sovereignty of God, they are encompassed by that sovereignty.
I was thinking of, well, let's talk about some scripture verses that talk about this relationship, to try to see, to help us discern what philosophy is saying. So what verses would you think of to say maybe that God is not forcing us from the outside to act? We talked about in book 4 about how he's sovereign over all things, but how about our choices?
Yeah. Well, one thing that scripture makes abundantly clear, doesn't it, that God is not the author of evil, and I'm trying to just locate that right now in terms of James. In terms of temptation, I think we've been there before.
Yeah, in the first chapter.
Let
of James.
no man say when I'm tempted when he is tempted, I'm tempted of God. For God doesn't tempt anyone. But he's neither tempted by evil nor does he tempt any man. Did I just murder that?
No, it's basically
and I think that's an indication, because, but that's also an indication of the tension in Scripture, that the temptation is there by God's sovereignty. And it's interesting because that same word, as you know, is used earlier in James 1 of trial and temptation. They're kind of used interchangeably. And so the temptation can become an occasion to sin, but when it becomes an occasion to sin, it's not as if the person can say, well, God is the author of my sin. James is abundantly clear. He doesn't even feel the need there to create a sense of explanation. He doesn't envision there a retractor, a detractor in that particular context. He just says it.
Yeah.
As if, well, of course, this is biblical. So James 1, I think is an important text, at least for me.
Yeah, that's good. I was thinking of James 4 also. Just what James assumes when he says, like, you're fighting and warring,
Mm-hmm.
you're with your lusts, yet you have not
Yeah.
because you ask not.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
the implied opposite side of that other side of that coin is, if you ask, you would have.
Right.
So James isn't saying you don't have because God planned from eternity past for you not to have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As if you're just, what can you do?
Right.
He's saying, if you ask, you would have had it.
Right.
And that's what Boethius has helped me so much with in relation to a verse like that, because it's easy as someone, as someone who is a Reformed Baptist, who has a Calvinist soteriology, it's so easy to slide into a determinism or a fatalism. Yes. But Scripture doesn't let us go there.
Right.
It's if I've sinned and I'm experiencing chastening from God because of my sin, I don't get to find an excuse by saying, well, God planned that from eternity past. And if I'm looking ahead, I don't get to say, well, if I choose the sin, God will work it for good, so I'm going to choose the sin. Or it doesn't matter what I choose because God has already ordained it from eternity past. No, the Scripture is saying, here's what you should not do. And if you would have gone in a different direction, something else would have happened.
Yeah.
You need to go in the right direction.
And I think that's precisely, I think, where Boethius is going here in his own circumstance and situation. So there's not a sense in which he's not letting his enemies off the hook in terms of this. Neither is he sort of giving himself over to a kind of fatalistic view. Sin is sin and evil, but I guess what I'm trying to say is fatalism is non-personal. It is just a force. That's all it is, and so it doesn't have any moral component. There's nothing there at all. But God is a loving creator, that we can see that on the basis of his creation, and he's interacting with us even in love and compassion, even though we're fallen beings. So fatalism, we can never go to fatalism, because that is impersonal force, whereas God has revealed himself as being imminently personal and engaging and kind and compassionate toward us.
And Boethius is clear about that in so many places. I'm thinking especially of some of the songs talking about the love that rules all things, and the love that moves the stars, and all this, living rightly in light of that love. And the end of the whole consolation is indeed, as you were saying, it's where Boethius is going, his responsibility. I love how Boethius translator Victor Watts describes the end of the book. He says, "We are left with philosophy's final exhortation on a high plane, our gaze directed upwards, oblivious of the prison house."
Yeah.
Saying, here's God in control of all things. What should I do? Well, philosophy says, reject vice and cultivate virtue.
Yeah.
Seek righteousness, pursue holiness, in the language of Hebrews, because God sees and knows all. You may be in pain, you may be in prison, but in the good guidance of God, pursue him. And she says, lift up your souls to righteous hopes. Offer humble prayers to heaven. God controls things. There's no fatalism, and your choices do matter. So pray to him, ask him for help, ask him for grace.
Well, and I think Paul, the Apostle Paul, reflects this in Romans 9, it seems to me, Brent, where he has that amazing, he imagines again his detractor, but you will say, but you will say, but you will say, and in verse 19 he says, you will say to me then, why does he still find fault? I mean, that, right? So that's the question that Paul imagines his detractor bringing up after his rather serious and very unequivocal demonstration of the sovereignty of God. And he says, yeah, I can imagine that you're going to think this. Why does he still find fault? For who can resist his will? But his response is, but who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why have you made me like this? Has the power no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? And he goes on. And I think he locates, I guess in a sense, although it's very strong here, I think what he's doing is he's drawing this detractor into a trust in the person and character and kindness, the attributes of God. Like don't assume something negative and something that is pejorative here. That this demonstration of the sovereignty and the exhaustive sovereignty of God is not a demonstration of God's harshness, but rather it is an expression of his kindness and his exhaustive knowledge, so that we can rest in him. And even when we don't understand, Boethius, like, I mean, after this, shortly after he writes this, he suffers a rather, if history is to be believed, a rather difficult death, a rather difficult execution. And but I think Boethius would say, who are you to answer back to God, just like Paul would say in Romans 9.
Yeah, that's good. I was thinking as you were saying that, Boethius is doing something different than Paul, because Boethius is using a lot of argument and thinking, and Paul's response is, well, who do you think you are? But it's not completely different, is it?
No, I don't think it is, because I think Paul takes people through the argumentation, just like Lady Wisdom has done here in the Consolation, and ultimately at the end, human knowledge is exhausted, and so the danger is at that point is that we're going to try to push beyond that and use that vacuum or that sense of what we don't know to, in a very arrogant way, accuse God. And I think that at least what I'm seeing in the Consolation here is that, yep, okay, we've gone to the limit, we've gone to the max, we can't go any further. Now let's trust the God who is the eternal God, who lives in that eternal present.